One of the Worf's sentences that I underlined about 30 years ago or 40 was, "A change in language can transform our apprehension of the cosmos." And you can't see that very strongly in the Indo-European group because they all have basically the same structure. But if you learn enough mathematics, you begin to think in a different way than Indo-European. And I was fortunate enough to encounter Ezra Pound and Ernest Fenollosa very early on. Pound thought Victorian poetry was a lot of slush and it had lost the qualities of true poetry. He established two rules for modern poetry. Don't use abstractions. If you want to deal with abstractions, write a philosophical essay, but don't try to pass it off as a poem. And the second rule is, after you get rid of all the abstractions, make the imagery as precise, definite, and clear as possible. And that was the beginning of the Imagist movement. And writing according to his own rules, Pound attracted the attention of the widow of Ernest Fenollosa. Fenollosa was a Harvard graduate who went to Japan and fell in love with Oriental poetry and Oriental painting. And he wrote several books trying to explain Oriental painting and poetry to Westerners. Before Fenollosa, there was a general impression among Western scholars that Chinese and Japanese poetry was primitive and crude. And Fenollosa argued that it was neither primitive nor crude, but very highly sophisticated. And that's why there are haiku all around these days, including computer haiku and movie review haiku and so on. It was Fenollosa who started the whole interest in brevity and precision of imagery in Oriental poetry, especially the haiku form, but in Chinese poetry generally, even in longer verse forms than the haiku. The whole emphasis is on the specificity and brilliance of the imagery, clarity of imagery. And Pound was writing in that style. Mrs. Fenollosa was looking for somebody to complete her husband's translation of a batch of Chinese poems. She read Pound. She decided he was the one. She turned her husband's notebooks over to him. And Pound thereafter embarked on a 40-year campaign of learning the Chinese language and translating most of the Chinese classics. And this led him to give up the term imagism and describe what he was doing as ideogrammic method. Chinese ideograms are not all made up of pictograms, but a certain percentage of them are. Well, Fenollosa had studied with Emerson, and Emerson was the one who said every word is a fossilized poem. That's much clearer in Chinese than it is in Indo-European. You look at the word for intelligence, for instance, and it's the sun and moon together.
In Chinese characters?
In Chinese characters. The sun and moon together, so intelligence and brightness are related. My God, we got that in English too. We say the student is bright when we mean the student is intelligent. It's more clear in the Chinese. You look at the sun and moon together. It's two kinds of light, which I think correspond to the right and left spheres of our brain. Or you take the Tao, which so many people have offered so many different translations of. You look at the ideogram, and it's a sign for intelligence together with a sign for movement. So the basic idea of the Tao is an intelligent movement. Take the Tao Te Ching. My Chinese pronunciation is abominable. It's even worse than my French. But I'm going to make a fool of myself and attempt it because I can't write the ideograms in the air. Ren Fa Di, Di Fa Tien, Tien Fa Tao, Tao Fa Tsu Ran. Now to take that literally word for word, remember every word in Chinese is both a noun and a verb and an adverb and an adjective depending on where it goes. It doesn't have the subject-predicate structure. But word for word, it's man, model, earth, earth model, universe, universe model, Tao, Tao models self, such. And this is an entirely different way of thinking than you think in Indo-European. I'm not trying to pass myself off as a Chinese scholar or anything like that, but the little bit of Chinese I picked up through Fenollosa and Pound and Alan Watts, who usually has the Chinese ideograms for the key terms, at least in some of his books, and Needham's Science and Civilization in China, in which he has all the scientific terms and philosophical terms from ancient China up through their evolution. China was ahead of the West in science up until the 17th century, and then something happened and the West got ahead. The little I know of math, the little I know of Chinese, and what I've read of about American Indian languages by Benjamin Lee Whorf, well, reinforced Korzybski's original impression upon me that if you use words in a particular way, it will influence the way you perceive the world, or it will even influence the way you behave.
When did Korzybski's main book come out?
Well, his first book came out in 1919. It was called Manhood of Humanity, and it was based on the theory of time binding, how signals passed across generations tend to accumulate faster and faster. It was about the information explosion, except that word hadn't been coined yet, so he called it time binding. His major work, Science and Sanity, came out in 1933.
And was this widely accepted?
It got a lot of enthusiastic reviews from a lot of distinguished people, and it had a tremendous impact on all of the social sciences for a while. Among the people who praised it, the anthropologist Malinowski, Bertrand Russell, the mathematician, Loeb, the biologist, quite a few, Poincaré, the mathematician, Bridgman, the physicist, along a very distinguished list. But then Martin Gardner in the 1940s wrote a book called Fads and Fallacies in the Name of Science, in which he denounced general semantics as quackery. And general semantics still exists. It's taught in lots of colleges. It still is a major influence on the social sciences, but it's not quite as reputable as it was in the 30s.
Didn't he have quite an influence on the beat movement as well?
Well, he had a big influence on William Burroughs. Burroughs studied with Korzybski personally. I studied with Korzybski's successors at the Institute of General Semantics, but Burroughs studied with Korzybski himself. Wow. Burroughs and I, really, that was one of the things we had in common, is that interest in how words influence perceptions. That's what led Burroughs to his experiments with cut-ups. If you break the lines of word and image, what happens? Do you get free of the patterns in there? Do you create new patterns, or are you still stuck with the same old patterns because you're using the same words? I think all of Burroughs' cut-up experiments are interesting. My favorite is in a book called The Third Mind, and it goes, "God damn floating whorehouse, death is the navigator." I have no idea what he cut up to produce those memorable lines, but I think that's some of the greatest poetry of the 20th century. He may have cut up a porno novel and a news story, or a porno novel and a poem by Dylan Thomas. Burroughs cut up all sorts of things. Burroughs did a short article in one of his books made up of cut-ups of the most devastating critiques written of his works by critics who didn't like his works. He cut them all up and made a word salad out of them. And he says, "I think this is one of the most remarkable pieces of prose I have ever produced, and I say so without any vanity at all, because I didn't contribute a single word. I just did the arrangement." I did the same thing, by the way, in a minor way. In The Earth Will Shake, the comments, when Sigismundo does his first public performance on the harpsichord.
Yeah, and no one can stand it.
Well, some of the audience likes it. Most of them can't stand it. All the critical comments are taken out of negative reviews of my own books. Only I cut them up a little and rearranged them so it could apply to music instead of books. I mean, you got to do something with negative criticism. You can either brood about it and get morbid, or try to forget it, or you can make a joke out of it. Joyce, I think, was the first one to realize the value of making a joke out of it. The 7th chapter of Finnegan's Wake, the Shem the Penman chapter, consists, maybe as much as 70% of lines taken from negative reviews of Ulysses.
What did he feel was the value of using them?
And Norman Mailer would say it was one way of saying "fuck you" to the reviewers.